Hello, it's Blue Orange 22. I'd like to make a video response to the most recent video from ContraPoints, aka Natalie Wynn, who's just done a video about men and masculinity and the men's rights movement. Now, I posted a link to her video down below. For those of you who aren't familiar, ContraPoints is a feminist YouTuber who makes videos about gender politics, equality, social justice, politics, and that sort of thing. But when I watched this video that she made yesterday, I wanted to make a response because she talks about the men's rights movement and she talks about some male issues and masculinity. And she repeats some of the very common misconceptions about the men's rights movements. And so I wanted to respond and kind of correct some of these myths and some of the things that she says about MRAs. You'll see in the video, she starts talking about MRAs about 4 or 5 minutes into it. She talks about how she's very skeptical of the men's rights movement because whenever she sees MRAs online, she doesn't really see them do any real activism. She just sees them talking about, what about men? Or this happens to men too. You know, in a way that's not really contributing to the conversation, but it's just trolling. And the example she uses was an article about women being harassed, and then a guy who, I don't even know if he's an MRA, she just says that he is, says, well, men are harassed too. And she dismisses that as trolling, and she dismisses that as not really being a valid point. And this argument is flawed for multiple reasons, actually. First of all, when a feminist says that she is skeptical about the men's rights movements, that I think is very flawed because it's the same thing when feminists say a man shouldn't really tell women that he's skeptical about women's issues because as a man, he doesn't experience those issues. So it's very easy for a man to say, well, I don't think catcalling is a big deal because he's not the one who has to experience it. Well, that's true, but that's also true the other way around as well. It's really not fair for feminist women to tell men that they're skeptical about men's issues because they aren't the people being affected by them. So feminists are very dismissive of the men's rights movements, but it's very easy to dismiss issues that don't affect you, and it's very easy to not care about issues that don't really affect your own life. MRAs talk about issues that actually affect us. These are things that actually happen to us. So we talk about them because they impact our lives on a day-to-day basis. I also don't think it's very fair, the whole argument of what about the men, or this happens to men too. And feminists will say that that's kind of a derailing argument and that's not really a valid argument. And they kind of dismiss it with this little line, or what about the men, or this happens to men too, as if that doesn't really count, or that's not really a fair argument. I disagree. I think that is a valid argument to make, because when you're talking about equality, you're talking about two sides of something, A and B being equal. And the only way to really measure equality is to compare the two sides. What's the same and what's different? Because if something is unequal, if it's unequal, then it means there's something in the middle that's not the same. Like A has something that B doesn't have, or vice versa. And so if you're talking about an issue like harassment, you can't only talk about one side if you want to achieve equality, because equality isn't equal. It's A equals B. So you really have to talk about both sides. So when MRAs say something like, well, what about the men? Or this happens to men too, we're saying it because it's happening to us. It's happening to us in our lives, and we need to be included in a conversation about an issue if you're going to say that you're trying to achieve equality. Especially when feminists say that feminism is about helping men too. And this is kind of going on to the next point when she's talking about how male issues are a result of the patriarchy and toxic masculinity, and says that, well, feminism is enough to address men's issues. But then you see the attitude that feminists have. When men try and talk about their issues in feminist spaces, they say, oh, well, you're just doing a what about the men, or that happens to men too. Well, if you don't think men deserve their own movement, then you have to expect that men are going to talk about male issues in feminist spaces. You say that feminism addresses male issues, and you say the best way to address male issues is through the lens of feminism. So how come you're so hostile to when men say, well, what about the men? Or this happens to men too. You're saying that feminism is talking about these issues to achieve equality. And you say that feminism is the best way to deconstruct patriarchy and toxic male structures. And then you say that the problem with toxic masculinity is that men aren't allowed to express themselves. But then, when men actually do express themselves and say, hey, what about harassment? This happens to us too. You shut us down and say, well, that's a what about the men, or stop derailing, or this isn't about men. So it really doesn't work to make that kind of argument. And I don't say, when I say you, I'm not directing this at ContraPoints directly. I just sort of mean something that MRAs get from feminists in general. I made a video about this a little while ago. Why do MRAs call themselves anti-feminist, and what is the whole debates between MRAs and feminists? I plan on making longer videos about this topic in the future. I just kind of wanted to do a quick reply now, but this video from ContraPoints was very interesting to me because it showed me, it really kind of reminded me just how much feminists and many people, they misunderstand the men's rights movement. They have a misconception about what the men's rights movement is and what MRAs actually believe. So watch her video, and if you'd like to watch my last video, that's the second link in the description below, and tell me what you think.